Hey, sports card fans, it's John, Boggs fan. Hope you're all doing well. Whenever I buy a new vintage card for my collection and show it off in one of my videos, I usually talk about the eye appeal of the card and how I enjoy the look of that particular card. Usually it's because it has very good centering, maybe some bright color, good registration. Sometimes I do talk about the particular flaws in the card that resulted in the specific number grade that it was assigned, but not to put down the card, but just to explain some of the reasons why the card may have gotten a particular grade. But overall, just talk about how I like the look of that card and how I'm glad to have that card now in my collection. What I don't usually talk about is the steps that I took prior to that led up to me buying that particular card. So in this video, I thought I would go over the 6 steps that I go through in picking out and hopefully winning and buying a particular card to add to my collection. So the first step, and this is one that I took when I first decided to collect vintage baseball cards, and that is determine my collecting focus. Now, what I ended up deciding doing is I wanted to buy Hall of Famers of baseball cards. So from 1948 to 1980, I wanted to focus on collecting as many cards featuring Hall of Famers as I could. Now, that's a pretty broad focus. I think there's probably over 2,000, I think, in my checklist of Hall of Fame cards from 1948 through 1980. So within that larger focus, I have some mini goals that I have to keep things interesting and maybe focus a little bit more in my searches, knowing that there are so many vintage Hall of Fame cards out there. One of the focus is a specific player run. So I just completed recently my Carl Yastrzemski playing day run, and I haven't decided who I'm going to work on next, but that could be another mini project of trying to complete that player's complete Topps run. I also have my 100 cards for $100,000. All 100 of those cards happen to be Hall of Famers, so it works with my overall goal of collecting Hall of Famers, but it's focused on trying to collect as many of those 100 cards as I can. Now for you, you may have a completely different focus. You may want to look at vintage basketball cards or hockey cards or football cards, boxing cards. You may be more into modern. So this could still maybe equate to maybe modern collecting, but it's more vintage focused for me. But you could collect cards of a particular team. You could collect cards of a particular set. You could work on trying to complete a set. Various ways of collecting and having a focus for your collection. So that's the overarching number 1 step that I took that I continue to factor in when I'm looking at potential cards to buy. All right, step number 2 is determine how much I have to spend. Now, I'm a stickler for my budget. I get paid every 2 weeks, and so I know within any pay period what my financial obligations are, household items, things like that, putting money into savings and all those things. So once I have those things budgeted for, I have some spending money for that 2-week period until I get paid again. Now, my spending money is fortunately not related or can't go all to baseball cards. There are other things that I'd like to do that would require me to have some spending money, some play around money. But usually I can determine how much within that 2-week period I have to spend on baseball cards. Now, first day of getting paid, I could take that amount and look to buy a card for that amount, and okay, then there's my budget for 2 weeks. That means essentially I can't buy a card for 2 weeks. I don't know if I've ever done that. Usually when I buy a more expensive card, it's because I've saved up some money, or I have some found money, or something that has allowed me to spend a decent amount of money on a baseball card. So I figure, how much I have to spend during that 2-week period, and I break it down pretty much per day. So let's say I have $20 a day that I could spend on baseball cards. Well, getting a graded vintage baseball card of a Hall of Famer for $20 is somewhat hard to do. Not impossible, but somewhat hard to do. So I may say, okay, let's wait a day, don't buy a card one day, and then the next day, in theory, I would have $40 that I could spend on a card. Well, there may be a card out there that I may say, okay, well, maybe I want to look in the $60 or $80 price range. Well, then I know that, okay, I didn't spend any money on cards yesterday. If I don't spend anything today, or if I do spend $80 in the next 2 days, maybe I can't spend money on cards. So that's my mindset when I look at how much money at any given time do I have to spend on a card. So once I determine, all right, I'm willing to spend right now $60 on a card. All right, then I move on to step 3. So I find a card, maybe it's one that I have in my watch list, or I see a video of someone else showing off a certain player's card. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe that card would be nice to add to my collection. And so the next step I take is I go to the vintage card prices and determine at what grade matches up, the price for a certain grade matches up with how much I want to spend. So again, let's say I have $60 that I want to spend on a particular card. So I'll go into vintage card prices and look up all the different PSA grades. And let's say in a PSA 6, an average price for that card is around $60. Okay, so now I know for this particular card, maybe I need to search for copies in a PSA 6. Now, I'm not one to buy a card based on the number grade, okay? I'm more on eye appeal. So while I may look at a 6, I may also look at what PSA 5 copies are on up for sale on eBay. Maybe I can find a PSA 5 with a just as good eye appeal as some of the 6s out there based on a technical grade, and maybe I can save a little bit of money by dropping down a grade but still getting a nice looking card. So all right, so now I have how much money I had to spend, what grade range do I need to look at in a PSA grade for eBay listings. So the fourth step then for me is I look for cards, again, listed around that price in that particular grade, either in this example 5 or a 6. So if I'm thinking spending around $60 and I see some buy it nows for $90, $100, I'm just going to pass by those listings because that doesn't match up with the comps, so to speak, maybe priced a little bit higher than, again, what I'm willing to pay in a particular grade. Maybe I'll find an auction that has a fairly low starting opening bid that maybe I'll follow and see if I could buy for the price that I'm willing to spend on a particular card. So again, whittling down the player, then the specific grade or grades that I want to look at, then to see the prices of those listings to see if any are in the range of what I want to spend. Then the fifth one, that's when I start narrowing it down even further and looking at eye appeal. So there could be cards listed in my example, a 5 or a 6 that are either have an opening bid or buy it now best offer that is in the price range of what I want to spend for that card. But if the eye appeal isn't there, then I pass that listing by. So again, it's narrowing it down. So you have a big universe here of a particular player's card in various grades. Then I narrow it down, and I further narrow it down to where I get to looking at specific details of that card. Is it well centered? Are some of the flaws minimal? Is it mainly some corner damage, some fuzzy corners? Are there creases? If there are creases, is it on the corner? If it takes away from the overall image of the card, I may not be interested in that. Print defects, sometimes they're okay, sometimes they bother me depending on how prominent or where they're located on the card. Is there snowing? Is the surface sort of scratched a little bit? So you could have a very well-centered card, and again, that's for me, that's my main criteria. You may have other criteria when you look for a condition or eye appeal. But for me, I could find a very well-centered card, but if the image of the player, the surface is snowy and takes away from the eye appeal of the image, that may be one that I would pass on. And then finally, whether it's a buy it now or specifically if it's an auction, I make sure that for the auction that I bid at a price again that I am willing to pay. Now, have I paid the high end of comps or over comps sometimes? Yes, I try not to. I tend to be a penny pincher when it comes to buying baseball cards. I'm always looking for a bargain out there because I figure, hey, if I can save money on one card, then that's some extra money that I can use to buy another card for my collection. So I'm always looking for a good deal, but there have been times where I find a particular card in a particular grade and it has a really good eye appeal. And sometimes with vintage, eye appeal is key, and sometimes you have to pay a premium for a card with great eye appeal for a technical grade. So it could be a PSA 4, but a very sharp looking PSA 4, and you may question, how did this card get a PSA 4? It looks like a 5 or a 6. Maybe, to the naked eye, you may not notice it, but maybe closer inspection, you may find some technical things wrong with that card that result in a, say, PSA 4 grade. But overall, those flaws don't mean much to you, and it looks like a great card. So again, the next time you see me show off a card and say, hey, look at this latest card here. Look how the great centering is, and the color of the card, the great image, registration, you name it. Know that there were 5 other steps that I took to finally get to that point of picking out that particular card. So I hope this helps, especially for those that are just getting into, especially vintage cards, because vintage cards, there's a lot more to it than, say, a modern card where you're just looking at a 9 or a 10, and sometimes you can't even tell the difference between a 9 or a 10. And you just look at that number grade, you look at the price and comps, and then boom, you go buy that card. For vintage, there's a lot more to it, especially with eye appeal versus the technical grade that card has. So would love to know in the comments, are these the 6 steps that I go through? Are they similar to yours? Do you have other steps that you follow? Are some of my steps not a concern for you? Do you, skip looking at a particular grade? Do you focus on a particular grade? So in other words, are you looking at a card in a collector grade? Maybe you say, hey, for a 1960s card, I'm not going to get anything less than a PSA 6. So would love to know what your steps, philosophy is in choosing the vintage cards that you purchase for your collection. So with that, that's all I have for you. So until next time, thanks for watching.